So we're picking up in the devotion section of Pyrrhus and Cineas, where Beauvoir has really gotten into the difficulties of relating between for itself, relationships between people, particularly where I've decided to devote myself to one person. But what I end up doing is usurping their ends and suggesting or enforcing my own, doing for them what I think they should do rather than the other. And she's started to get to the point where she's saying, here's how these relationships are actually sort of functioning. The reason why these problems arise, right, is because of the difficulty we have with really recognizing and respecting the for itself as a for itself. Because again, even though they exist as a for itself and they have their own experience of their interiority and the way the world appears to them, the other still appears to me as an object, essentially, as an appearance, as something that appears to me. This can be the problem with expressing gratitude. When someone does something for you, again, they're not really doing it for you. What they're doing is creating a jumping off point or a point of departure for you to do for yourself. Again, the child in the tree, they want to climb the tree. If you just lift them up and put them in it, they haven't climbed the tree. You've put them in a place where maybe they wanted to be there, but they wanted to get there themselves. So you can't do it for them. You can only offer opportunities for them. This creates an interesting problem with expressions of gratitude, because there's no way, it's not a matter, she says, of paying a debt or of collecting a debt. And in some sense, if you try to do a tit for tat, it becomes almost offensive. You're measuring now the worth to you as a material thing, the way that you would pay for a can of soda or something like that, right? What I did for you or the opportunity that I opened for you is worth sort of so much, the way that we appraise or value things. So it's not like a paying off debt, right? And that's where she gets to what we sort of ended, or we approached in the end of our last video. We are therefore never anything but an instrument, even when we are an obstacle, like the air that supports Kant's dove while resisting it. And I think Beauvoir, with her literary eye, has found the one poetic line in the Critique of Pure Reason, this line about the dove in the air, that she cites here on page 125. It's kind of funny. But anyway, this problem of being instrumental in the lives of others and others being instrumental in my life, highlights a real problem for Beauvoir. And she returns then to that discussion of Christianity's reduction of everything to use value. Useful for what? Useful for the messianic narrative of salvation, right? So she talks about this problem. The most striking illustration of the paradox is found in the Christian religion. The Christian is for others, only an instrument in the hand of God, yet he is accountable to God for all his actions. What good is it to care for the sick and relieve the suffering when sickness and misery are tests willed by God and good for the soul? In order to justify himself, a Christian father whose tyrannical conduct provoked or hastened the death of his daughter said, "After all, I was only an instrument in the hands of God." The Christian knows that through him it is always God who acts. Even if he leads his neighbor into temptation, it is because the neighbor was supposed to be tempted. So she views Christianity as having this paradox at its heart, where I'm responsible for my actions before God. I'm to be judged according to how I lived my life and what I've done. And yet, at the same time, I'm just an instrument in God's hands. So I am both responsible for God, but I am also not responsible for God, the paradox, because God creates all things, and he just acts through us as instruments. So again, we can't view ourselves completely as an instrument, because we have an experience of the world as a for itself, and things have meaning and value relative to our projects, which are varied and they're not easily subsumed under one sort of master narrative like the messianic narrative. but at the same time, I'm supposed to subvert all of my ends. My ends can become usurped and interpreted as being underneath that paradigm, that they only have meaning relative to such a meta project. So this creates the kind of paradox. And again, she's already pointed out one important ambiguity earlier in Pyrrhus and Cineas, where every end is also a beginning. But she's also working and will develop more robustly in the ethics of ambiguity this ambiguity between being in itself as a body, being an object, and being a subject that is a for itself. So appearing in the world as an object, even sometimes appearing to myself as an object, while at the same time existing in the world as a subjectivity that has experiences and can see the future and make guesses about what might happen, or to plan to make sure that something happens, and all that, kind of stuff. So again, she views Christianity as sort of paradoxical, and so you can see that harkens back to those earlier sections where she talks about the impossibility of God as a saving grace that will save us from our freedom and that kind of thing. Right. Moving out of that paradox of Christianity, she says, one must not believe that I could elude the responsibility for that situation on the pretext that the other is free. That is his business, not mine. I am responsible for what I can do, for what I am doing. There is a convenient and false way of thinking that authorizes all abstentions, all tyrannies. Peaceful and satiated, the egoist declares. The unemployed, the prisoners, the sick are as free as I am. Why reject wars or misery if a man remains just as free in the worst circumstances? But only the impoverished man can declare himself free in the midst of his misery. And abstaining from helping him, I am the very face of that misery. So again, we can't, like the egoist here, just, well, okay, so we're all free, everybody's responsible for his actions. This is the kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of stuff. All those excuses, well, I did it, I'm free, I work to where I am, why can't other people just do the same? They're all moochers and that kind of thing. That doesn't work for Beauvoir, because insofar as you present yourself as an obstacle to them, you abstain from helping other people. You're an obstacle for them. You're the face of their oppression or of their misfortune, right? So you cannot wiggle out you can't use your responsibility on the one hand and claim it, and then on the other hand deny your responsibility in the projects of other people, right? This is a kind of bad faith. Like, you're trying to claim responsibility as a way to escape responsibility for others. So on the one hand, you acknowledge your freedom and your responsibility, but you use it as if it's like a thing that you can have, like a property, in order to flee from the claims that other people make on you, right? So I must accept or reject, and I say that I can do nothing for the other or against him, but that does not release me from caring about my relationship with him, because whatever I do, I exist before him. I am an appearance and a presence to the other that has a role and a meaning relative to the other's projects and situation in the world. I can affect that situation sort of through my actions, creating opportunities for them. Later, Beauvoir will use this language of opening their future to them, or denying it, closing it. I can use my freedom to deny them theirs. But Beauvoir makes a really important point in the following sections, where she talks about something that I think is very difficult for people, and it's something that I think is objected to within existentialism. So she talks about how your freedom cannot be denied, and she leans upon sort of a distinction that Descartes makes, where you have on the one hand the reality of your freedom metaphysically, and then on the other hand you have the power to exercise your freedom. Metaphysically, your freedom cannot be taken from you. You are, in your very being, free. That's the ground of your being as a for itself, is this free and spontaneous arising into the world with the introduction of nothingness into reality, into being. But your power to act from your freedom can be curtailed by your situation. So, from the metaphysical perspective, the prisoner or the slave is not unfree. They retain their metaphysical freedom even in the state of bondage. This is one of the things that makes... So even though that sounds weird to say, I think from the perspective of existentialism, this is exactly one of the things that makes bondage unacceptable and something terrible to have to suffer. Because the person can't ignore their freedom forever, but they're faced with a situation in which the power to act from that freedom is very strictly curtailed. So on the one hand, they suffer because they recognize their freedom, but they have no power to act on it, right? This is something, again, we'll talk more about in the ethics of ambiguity, but it's a really important point that she makes for existentialism broadly in Pyrrhus Cineas, that, yeah, you can prevent people from exercising their freedom, but you cannot take people's freedom from them. This is the whole thing about how bad faith works, and all of the strategies, the philosophical strategies Beauvoir's been outlining and will continue to outline throughout her work, of when people are trying to flee from their freedom and get away from their responsibility. Well, you can't. You're stuck with it. You're stuck with it even if you're in prison, even if you're in bondage, if you're a slave in the most extreme kind of circumstances and that kind of thing. You are still free to determine your relationship to those things and to partake in the generation of its meaning. And you can die on your knees or fighting and that kind of thing. Now, that's not a great situation to have to enact your freedom from, sure. I don't think Beauvoir would say that it was. But you're still free. That's the ultimate. The short of it is, no matter what happens, metaphysically speaking, you still have your freedom, and that can't be taken from you, even if your power to exercise that freedom is severely curtailed, or your options are very limited by your situation, right? So that's, I think, definitely something to think about, this distinction, and what Beauvoir takes to be the sort of metaphysical fact of your freedom. So, yeah, she argues very forcefully for that in these sections about devotion and communication, and I think it's one of the primary philosophical maybe takeaways from the last part of Pyrrhus and Cineas. That and other people. I need other people for my project to have meaning. My situation is in part defined by the projects of other people. My project gains part of its value and its meaning from the way it interacts and the roles that other people play in that project and its inflection through their projects and so on and so forth. You don't exist in just a vacuum. That's why she quotes the dove line from Kant. Part of that is the dove imagines it would be easier to fly without the air if it could fly in a vacuum, but of course it can't. It can't fly in a vacuum, and so your project can't take on meaning in the abstract. That's again part of the problem with trying to expand yourself into the infinite. It becomes a intellectual game of abstraction, and not a particular project that has meaning relative to a particular end that you have established from your sort of individual position, historical trajectory and background and all of that, kind of stuff. Right. She says that this is the error of Kantian ethics, is to have claimed to make an abstraction out of our own presence in the world. Therefore, it leads only to abstract formulas. The respect of the human person in general cannot suffice to guide us because we are dealing with separate and opposed individuals. The human person is complete both in the victim and in the executioner. Shall we let the victim perish or kill the executioner? So there's a very clear statement of how the projects relate to each other, and some of them are mutually exclusive. My project doesn't just gain meaning from other people, but sometimes it's opposed. It can be a hindrance as well as a point of departure and an opportunity for them. That's what she says. The human person is complete in both the victim and the executioner, and we have to decide on whose side we're on. Now, these projects are opening new possibilities, right? And they're one that we have to choose between. So the question again that keeps getting brought up is, how do you choose? How do you choose between the victim or the executioner? How do you choose whether or not to be a help or a hindrance? How do you choose to take other people's attempts to help or hinder you? I mean, do you can turn certain obstacles into an opportunity, or so on and so forth, by your relation and the actions that you take toward it. So again, she just reiterates this question, and saying, answering the question how to choose is possible because each one of us is truly at the core of his life. I want the biggest piece, says the child, looking greedily at the cake that his mother has just cut up. Why would it be yours rather than another's? Because it's me. So we feel the singular force of our decisions and our actions from our particular and special situation as being the owner of the point of view. I am the person who has this point of view. So I feel myself sort of special, while other people appear as objects to me. But I often delude myself, right? Beauvoir is quick to point out this delusion that I am just another for someone else. I'm just an object that appears to another person. And they feel themselves special, right? So there's where we start also to get the ground of some of that conflict, where we're all making claims of our own specialness, but we can't, again, we are and we aren't sort of special. We are all individualized, and we all feel ourselves in our particularities as from our particular situation, and so on and so forth. But we also all appear as objects to each other. Again, playing on that ambiguity. And she also talks about how we play on this feeling. We know that we all feel each other special. She talks about the salesman. Oh, well, I'll give you a good price because it's you, right? Appealing to this sense of special. So what Beauvoir really wants to drive home here is exactly how can I define my situation before others. She knows that there's this problem, and she's outlined this problem between the appearance of the world to me and my knowledge of my own subjectivity and the subjectivity of others, while at the same time others appear to me just as objects and I appear as objects to others. Other men exist only as objects. We alone grasp ourselves in our intimacy and our freedom as a subject. What is puerile in the child and in the housewife example that she had given is believing that their privilege exists in the eyes of others because each person is only a subject for himself. So that's what I just sort of walked through. And so we must now try to define what my situation is before others. And here's where she's seeking the foundation of our actions. If we can define my situation before others, only then can we attempt to find a foundation for our actions. And here she brings up Sartre's idea of a negativity. Negativities are just, it's the phenomenological appearance of a nothing. The famous example that Sartre gives is his friend Pierre in the cafe. I'm supposed to go and meet Pierre in the cafe, and I go to the cafe and I look around and I see that Pierre's not there. So Pierre is present to me through his absence. This is a negativity. I notice Pierre is absent. So there is an absence that appears to me when I go to the cafe and Pierre is not there. So the negativity is the appearance of that absence. I go into the cafe, I look around, Pierre's not there. He's absent. And that absence appears to me, right? I take note of this nothingness that is, the negation of the presence of Pierre that I expected. Negativities are really important phenomenologically, and in all of our projects they're important. Like when you notice something is missing, right? If you're trying to fix a car and there's a part missing, that's a negativity, right? You look in there and you know it's supposed to be one way. There's supposed to be a hose connecting these two parts or something, and it's missing, it's gone. Right, there it is. The absence is present to you, the negativity. So she introduces this here: voids, lacks, absences seep into the world. And they only seep into the world through us. Negativities don't exist without human existence, or some existence as for itself. Because we're the only ones who are able to have like expectations and anticipate certain things happening, right? Like, because I'm able to view the moon over the month, and I know it has all these phases. I'm only because I'm able to see that whole sequence and hold it as a for itself in my memory and so on, am I able to look up at the crescent moon and say, oh, it's missing a quarter of it, or 3/4 of it, or whatever. That moon is able to appear to me as this void or as a lack only because I can anticipate that it will become full. And without that, it's just a line in the sky. I mean, it's just whatever it is. It's not lacking anything. It just is as it is. It's a fullness of being. It's only the for itself that's able to introduce these absences or voids into the world. Okay, so that's just a review of negativities from Being and Nothingness, basically, that Beauvoir is drawing on here. She says that some men refuse to make use of this power. So she sees this ability to negate as a foundational power of the for itself. But some people don't like that. For them, they want everything to be full. They want to participate in the fullness of being. They want to coincide with a being, and they want their being to be dictated to them so that they don't have to make a choice, so that they don't have to feel anguish in the face of their freedom. Everything around them is full. They see no place for anything else. Every novelty frightens them, and reforms must be forcibly imposed upon them. We did fine in the past without these inventions. And then, of course, other people are happy to have new inventions, and they are excited about reforms and everything like that. But we sometimes perceive new inventions as fulfilling like something that's missing, or as a need that once we get the new invention, now the need is fulfilled. But remember what she had said previously, that there exists no pre-existing niche for people to slide into. So we perceive that a new invention has met a need only in hindsight. She says, and indeed, now that it exists, the airplane responds to a need, but it is a need that it created by existing, or more exactly, that men freely created based on its existence. Human freedom must then carve out a place for this new plenitude that we caused to spring forth into the world. This place was not, and neither are the ones who made it. We have only made the object that fills it up. Only the other can create a need for what we give him. Every appeal and every demand comes from his freedom. So we create objects, and then there arises, relative to the creation of that object, some need that then the object can fulfill. There was no pre-existing need that the object then filled up. The need arose exactly out of the creation of the object. So this is, I think, something we should think a bit more about, and we will talk a bit more as we proceed through the end. We're getting close. We're approaching the end of Pyrrhus and Cineas here. But we have to think about this role between the generation of objects and the generation of need. Because we can try to pose counterexamples where, well, if people are starving, or if there's an illness that requires a specific fix, or something like that, isn't there then a need that gets filled when you invent something that cures the illness or addresses the hunger problem in this area or something like that? Well, yes and no, because you're responding to an appeal of other people, You're responding to something that people are saying they need, but they're also not strictly demanding something super specific. Yeah, if someone is hungry, if people are hungry in a particular community, they'll express that they need food. And that's a sort of a concrete need. But they're not telling you exactly it has to be this way. By necessity, you have to bring in food on these specific trucks, through this specific route, through this specific way. That need can be met in a variety of ways, and in a variety of creative ways. It can be met in part through like community gardening, or bringing in produce more from the outlying local area, or rearranging patterns of distribution within a city, such that food that already exists within the city is just distributed better and into this community, right? So all of those are meeting a demand that people are making, but they then become necessary sort of after the fact. Like if you redistribute the food goods throughout the city, then people need that redistribution to maintain in place. Whereas if you brought in food, new food that wasn't previously in the city, and you're trucking it in from somewhere else, now the need for that line of transportation between grower and community is necessary, and so on and so forth, right? So it's the specificity and the particularity of the needs that are really generated by the object and the solution that might be proposed or implemented to meet a kind of a general demand that a community has, or that a group of people have, or something like that. We'll talk more about this as we proceed, because we're so used to thinking that the world is laid out there with these predetermined meanings and predetermined necessities, but existentialism has rejected that. So they have to rethink how that stuff works. If there's no predetermined or inherent significance in the world that comes from on high, or something like that. Okay. So I think that we will stop there. Through that, we've gotten through a good bit of the communication section. We'll pick up there, and we will continue sort of through the end. So we're almost done with Pyrrhus Cineas, unfortunately. I've really enjoyed talking about this essay, I'm sure you can all tell. So we'll start to wrap up, and maybe we'll have like 2 more videos on Pyrrhus Cineas. Okay, thanks.